Okay, so welcome everybody. Today I'm going to start the endocrine system. You should have all received an email from me that explained why I pre-recorded a lecture on the autonomic nervous system for you. We've got 3 chapters on the next test. The test is a week from today. And I could have gotten the autonomic nervous system presented with the endocrine system, but it would have been going really fast. And the autonomic nervous system is just 1 hour. Most of that information is, quite honestly, a repeat. It's simply sympathetic versus parasympathetic. And that is largely, I would say, 90% things that you were asked to know in 105. So I think you'll have no trouble reviewing that material. The other portion of this exam comes from Chapter 6. That was the short, was it 45 minutes to an hour, that I was able to cover in total on the skeletal system. Again, largely review. Fractures, what happens during a fracture. I introduced a couple of new kinds of fractures, and there I mentioned a couple of hormones. I mentioned the calcitonin and the parathyroid hormone. That was really the meat and potatoes of the physiology of that chapter. The largest portion of this exam will come from this chapter, Chapter 16, on the endocrine system. And what makes it challenging, it's like everything else. It's not like any one fact is difficult, but there are a lot of endocrine organs, and there's quite a few hormones presented. And this handout that I'm giving you, the first couple of pages are about the autonomic nervous system. But as you get over to, actually page 2, right, starts saying, tell me about the classes of hormones, and page 3, ADH, and that one you already know a little bit about. But then really on page 4 is where it kind of starts, kind of very systematically. The heading is the gland. Underneath it are the hormones that are produced. And what I want you to know is, where is a hormone produced and what's it doing? You know, what's its purpose? What's its job? Which means you also need to know its target. Where is that hormone going in your body, and what responses will occur as a result of that hormone being released? And then keep in mind that not all, but many hormones are in a yin-yang relationship, like glucagon and insulin, or like ANH and renin that you know a little bit about. And you also should remember that term negative feedback, right? A term that we have barely introduced in 105, but I will jump into today. And that is, how is it that hormones are regulated? So that's what we've got. I've got about, I've got the next 2 presentations. That's 4 hours of time, and I probably only need about 2.5 to 3 hours of that time, which will leave a good solid hour, is my plan. So I want to be able to give you a good, 45 minutes, I won't say an hour, but a good time to ask questions next time at the end. Now, I can't require it, but I would suggest, if what I'm saying today is feeling a little bit, oh wow, there's a lot of stuff here, I might even suggest that you listen to last winter's presentation, the second one on the endocrine system, so that when you come in next Tuesday, you're not hearing it for the first time. You might find it very, very beneficial to go ahead and listen to both of the endocrine lectures. I think they're both about 1 hour and 20 minutes. They were 1.5 hour lectures. There's about 3 hours or less of talk. But you may find it helpful to jump ahead and listen to that, so that when we meet together next Tuesday, this is not brand new for you. And as you're listening to the lecture, perhaps you're filling out this form. You're just kind of doing the very best you can to get the hormones listed and get an idea of their function. And then when we have lecture together next Tuesday, you're filling in the gaps rather than starting fresh. So that's just my recommendation to you. I know this exam is coming on fast. One of the reasons, a couple things, just to explain it, the first exam was kind of late. It really was. It was a little bit late. There was a lot of material in that first exam. I have graded your exams, the objective part and the hieroglyphic extra credit part, and I will spend the weekend looking at the short answers. It's going to take me some while, as you can imagine, to get through about 120 short answers. Most students, thank you, did both. I say thank you, that's good. It's a lot more work for me. But most of you did do both questions, and so it's going to take me some time to get through those. It won't make a big a difference on your grade, and what I will do is that on Tuesday, I will, even early Tuesday, you can go and review the exam with Hillary in the office if you want to do that. It may not have the short answer grade on there yet, but you can certainly go in and look at the key and look at the short answer portion, which was the vast majority of the exam. So if you're worried about how that went. So far, I have graded a couple of exams, and I have grades as high as about a 97%. Okay, so, you know, the exam was doable and approachable, and I don't know how it's going to lay out as far as an overall distribution. If I find that the exam was really challenging and that the class needs a little bit of a push, I will give a small curve. I'm not going to promise that. It'll just depend on how the class did. The lab exams, I will not curve. And as I think I alluded to last time, they weren't pretty for a lot of students. So those are, I do have, and you can look at those next week as well. So with all that said, next Tuesday we'll continue endocrine. Next Thursday we'll have the exam. It'll be, again, a 2-hour exam. You'll have the entire time to take it. There will not be a written part. Okay, I've determined I've got enough writing to do grading to this weekend of writing. So there won't be another short answer portion on exam number 2. So don't worry about that. If I had a short answer question, it would have been compare and contrast, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And it probably would have been compare and contrast the nervous system with the endocrine system. And, I'm just not going to go there with those short answers. So make sure you've listened to, if you haven't already, the autonomic nervous system. It's 1 hour flat. It's not very long. You've got that skeletal presentation we had before, which wasn't terribly long. And then this chapter will be the big one for this. After this, where are we heading? We're going to be heading to muscle. So after the endocrine system, we're going to head into muscle, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and from cardiac muscle, then we'll be jumping into the heart, cardiovascular, blood pressure, heart sounds, and all that good stuff, and cardiac output, and then we'll be moving toward respiratory, urinary, reproductive. So we've got a lot of work to do still in front of us.
Next Thursday, is it the same thing? We'll have the whole class?
You have the 2 hours to do it, no other thing going on. So you'll have the full 2 hours. Okay. Any questions, just logistical? Okay, let's get going. Okay, so the chapter, you may want to have your little note set there with you, again, if it helps you. If not, just use it as a guide. It's not something you're going to turn in, ladies and gentlemen. It's just something that might help you stay organized as we go through this. Again, the endocrine system. Here's a nice little comparison at the very beginning. I got past the objectives there. And you know that these are the two systems that are really maintaining your homeostasis. Yes, all systems interact in some way with maintaining homeostasis, but it's really the endocrine system and the hormones and the nervous system and the neurotransmitters and the action potentials that really keep your body humming along with homeostasis. They both use chemicals, don't they? Right, they both use chemicals. The nervous system uses neurotransmitters, right, chemicals that are released at the synapse, and the endocrine system uses hormones that are released and traveling through the body and through the blood. And they are both regulated by negative feedback, which means basically the body doesn't make extra. So the body is not going to bother spending time or energy making something it doesn't need. So when there's plenty of something, it basically sends a signal back and says, we've got enough right now, thank you very much, shut down the production. So that's true of the nervous system, that's true of the endocrine system. And they work together, they really do. And I think there was even a question in the last exam saying, what's the structure that kind of is hovering between endocrine and nervous system? Hypothalamus, right? So the hypothalamus is certainly a part of the nervous system, but also is releasing hormones. So we know that that's one of those structures that is involved with both of these systems. Now, when you think of the endocrine system, what comes to mind? Hormones. As the word endo suggests, within, and crine, to secrete. So we're secreting something within the body, typically into the bloodstream, and that signal is going far, far away, right? It's traveling through the bloodstream to any tissue or cell in the body that has a receptor, right? That's how the hormones work. Do you remember? I mean, the nervous system is very specific, right? If an action potential is sent down a neuron, that signal is only going to go to the effector, that is to the muscle or the gland or the next neuron. Very specific, very discrete. But when it comes time for the endocrine system, remember that these hormones are traveling through the entire body. And any cell could respond to that hormone if it has a receptor. So there are specific protein receptors on the surface of the cells. And for example, there's an insulin receptor. And if a cell has an insulin receptor and there's insulin around, then that cell will respond to insulin in whatever way that does. If there is no insulin receptor, then the cell is blind to that hormone. So it doesn't matter how much insulin there is in the bloodstream. If the cell does not have a receptor for it, then it doesn't see it. It can't be affected by it. Now, endocrine, we normally think of things going far, far away, but there are other ways that cells communicate with each other. Now, this brings us back a little ways back, really to last semester. You may recall that some cells have gap junctions. Basically, that's intercalated discs. Remember, intercalated discs are connectors between cardiac muscle cells that allow for communication directly. Epithelial tissues also have these gap junctions, allowing for molecules to transfer from one cell to the next. So that would be a direct communication method, cell to cell, side by side. They're touching each other. Then there's paracrine. Para, what does para mean to you? Paranasal, paravertebral, para, next to. Paracrine secretion is where one cell releases something and into the neighborhood. And there's a cell somewhere nearby, right, para, next to, that is affected by that substance. And those substances are released not into the bloodstream, but into the extracellular fluid, into the neighboring fluid. Another name for that extracellular fluid is what?
Plasma. Interstitial.
Interstitial fluid is what I'm looking for, right? So the interstitial fluid or the extracellular fluid, and that's going to interact with cells in the near neighborhood. And then there's endocrine. Right? And normally this is released into the bloodstream, travels far, far away, and goes through the blood to a far, far away target. And then finally, another way of communicating is at a synapse. And that really is a very unique type of interaction that is included with nervous system and with synapses and neurotransmitters. So we're just talking about different ways that cells communicate one with another. Now, hormones. Let's get into hormones a little bit. Hormones come in a few different types, okay? And it will be important, and it will make sense as we go through this. The type of hormone, the way that it is. In other words, is the hormone a protein or is the hormone a steroid? Right? We've all heard of testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. Those are hormones that are steroid-based. Steroids, remember, are a type of fat, right? They're a lipid molecule. They're going to behave differently in the bloodstream and differently traveling into and out of a cell than other hormones that are proteins, that aren't lipids, but instead are made of amino acids. So the first group that I want to introduce to you are amino acid-like hormones. Thyroid hormone is an example. So you'll be kind of keeping these categories together in your head. Thyroid hormone is produced by the thyroid gland. Another group of amino acid-like neurotransmitters are the catecholamines. That's a really big word for epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. You've at least heard of those. When you hear the word epinephrine, you normally think of fight or flight, right? Sympathetic epinephrine. There's a cousin, a sister molecule called norepinephrine. And then there's dopamine that came by in the conversation a couple of times in the nervous system. Those are all derived from amino acids. They're very small molecules. Now, what's another name for epinephrine? Adrenaline. And another name for norepinephrine? Noradrenaline. So if you come across adrenaline or noradrenaline, it's the same as epinephrine and norepinephrine. They're just different names for the same thing. Then another amino acid hormone is melatonin. You may have heard of melatonin. It is one that is released by your pineal gland. Now, the pineal gland is a little tiny gland in the epithalamus, in the thalamus region, the diencephalon region, and it is a derivative of tryptophan. So tryptophan is one of the 20 amino acids. So melatonin is a very small molecule derived basically of a single amino acid. So these are very small neurotransmitters, or very small hormones. Then there are peptide hormones. Peptide is a way of saying a group of amino acids linked together. Okay, and most of the hormones in your body are of this group. They are going to be peptide hormones. They will be synthesized as prohormones, basically an inactive precursor. If the body made hormones directly, then they could act on other tissues inappropriately. And so the body makes first pro-hormones, which will then be activated to become active hormones. We'll talk about that mechanism. They can be relatively, just a small group, right? A short group of amino acids, 2 small proteins. Here, examples include TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Just for completeness, do you remember what organ releases those 3? The pituitary gland, specifically the anterior pituitary. So I'm going to try to make those connections as often as I can so that when we see these again, you're thinking about this and it's in your notes more than one place. So these are the peptide hormones. Finally, there are the lipid-derived hormones. These are your steroid-based hormones. These are all based upon cholesterol. Okay? So your estrogen, your progesterone, testosterone, those are all based on cholesterol. If you don't have cholesterol, you're not going to have adequate sex hormones. There's also another group in here called eicosanoids. And these are really, really important. You may have heard of leukotrienes or prostaglandins. These are also molecules that are released. They can work as endocrine or paracrine. The leukotrienes can work sort of like hormones, and the prostaglandins as well. Now, the term prostaglandins, it was first thought that it was made by the prostate gland only, and we found out that it's made by other tissues. So sometimes these names are misleading. It sounds like something made by the prostate gland, right? And it was or it is, but it also was discovered to be made by many other organs as well. Leukotrienes, something about white and 3, right? And we'll see that some of those molecules were made by white blood cells. So they were initially named that, but we'll see that they're made by many other cells as well. So we've got 2 different kinds of lipids. We've got those eicosanoids, and then we've got the steroids. And these are the ones you're more familiar with. If a hormone ends in sterone, right? So aldosterone, right? Or progesterone, estrogen, testosterone. Those are kind of key terms, meaning these are steroid hormones. Now, if you're a steroid hormone, what does that suggest to you about how you can travel through the blood? What are steroids? Fats, lipids, non-polar, right? And how would these molecules travel through the blood? The blood is largely aqueous. So what does it suggest to you about how these hormones would travel? Can they just travel through the blood? Can oil just travel through water? Right? They separate, right? They don't go well together. So that suggests to us that these hormones must be carried or protected as they are traveling through the blood. But what else do we know about steroids and membranes? Membranes are, remember the phospholipid bilayer? So that tells you that a steroid, even though it would have difficulty traveling through the aqueous blood, would have a very easy time getting across the cell membrane. Okay, we'll start thinking about this a little bit. This is why women should never hold on to some medications that are steroid-based, especially if they can have an effect on an unborn child. So any kind of steroid pill, like the estrogen patches, the testosterone patches, those can just be put on the skin and they can be absorbed into the bloodstream because these steroid-like molecules can be absorbed directly through the skin and directly into the blood and into your cells. Okay, so we'll be thinking about that a little bit. How is it that these molecules get around? Look what it says in the bottom thing here. It says these steroid hormones, right? We know they're made by the reproductive organs, right? Testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. But it says in the second bullet, they are bound to specific transport molecules. They must be, quote, carried through the bloodstream. And because they're being carried, they're also, quote, being protected. So as they travel through the bloodstream, they're being carried and they're being protected, so they tend to stick around a little bit longer. So a steroid hormone is going to have a longer what we'll call half-life, a longer time in your bloodstream than a protein hormone. A protein hormone doesn't need to be carried, right? It can interact directly in your blood, but it's more prone to being destroyed or broken down or degraded over time. So protein hormones will have a shorter half-life, will hang around a less time, but don't need a carrier. And steroid hormones need a carrier, and because of that, they're protected and hang around longer. So let's keep thinking about those ideas. Anything in that conversation that's not jiving with you? I got some pictures coming up to help you see this visually. You are not going to be asked to draw out nor recognize these hormones. Okay, and for that I should hear an amen or hallelujah, right? We don't have to memorize these. But I do want you to at least recognize how small these are. Look at the pink ones on the top. These are the amino acid derived. I told you that the thyroid hormone was one of those, and one form of thyroid hormone is called thyroxine. Now notice it's just a couple small amino acids. Again, you don't need to recognize that chemically, but it's a very small molecule. A couple of amino acids. Epinephrine, dopamine, and norepinephrine, I told you, they're all called catecholamines. That's a term you want to know. The catecholamines are a collective group of molecules to which epinephrine and dopamine belong. And I mentioned also melatonin was derived from another amino acid, tryptophan. Very small, right? That's what I want you to think. Very, very small molecules. Then I mentioned there were peptide hormones. They come in all sizes, relatively bigger than amino acids, but quite large proteins. And then there are the lipid-derived, and this includes the eicosanoids that make the prostaglandins, and the steroids, for example, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. Just a picture, nothing you have to memorize, just another way of thinking about it. Now, the endocrine system is made up of a number of organs, all of which release hormones. So here's a list. This is not a complete list, but, well, yeah, it is. It's a complete list. We're going to say these are primary organs. Hypothalamus, pituitary gland, thyroid gland, adrenal gland, pancreas, pineal, parathyroid. Those are, if I were to give you an image and say label the endocrine organs, those are the ones that would be primarily listed in that model or that image. But in addition to those, there are other organs that do release hormones. You already know that the kidneys do, right? We talked about renin. We don't think of the kidneys as primarily being an endocrine organ, but they do release hormones. We don't think of the heart as being an endocrine organ, but we know that it does release ANH or ANP. So those are kind of on the secondary list. So this other organs, heart, kidneys, intestines. We're learning that the stomach and the intestines are releasing all sorts of crazy hormones, and we're learning more and more that those hormones have a bigger effect than we ever thought, not just on digestion, but also on the nervous system. So we now know there's a greater hormonal connection between the gut and the brain than we ever knew 20 years ago. There's a lot of research going on there. And then the reproductive organs, of course, are making hormones as well. So I'll be going through these different glands. I'll be mentioning the hormones that they produce. As we go through it, you'll be asking yourself, okay, is that an amino acid or a peptide or a steroid hormone? Kind of put it into one of those categories. And then you'll be asking, what does that hormone do? Why is it released? What triggers its release? And what does it do when it is released? And what cells are responding to it? So the hypothalamus, you already know this. It releases some hormones involved with fluid balance. We saw that, right? What's released from here? ADH, right, is released from the hypothalamus. It also releases hormones that involve smooth muscle contractions. What's that hormone? What's the other hormone made by the hypothalamus? We haven't talked about it this semester yet, but it's involved with smooth muscle contractions. Think childbirth. Oxytocin, right? Oxytocin is also made by the hypothalamus and is all about uterine contractions. Okay, so you make that connection there. And then the third group, the hypothalamus is also largely in control of all the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. what you're going to see is that in the endocrine system, one gland releases a hormone that talks to another gland that then releases another hormone, that then talks to another gland that releases another hormone. It's rarely one hormone, one effect, done and over, right? There's always a lot of crosstalk going on, and that I think also adds to the complication of this system. Then the hypothalamus is very much in charge of releasing or inhibiting or controlling the anterior pituitary. There are quite a few hormones made here. In fact, there are 7, and you will get to know them well. There is melanin produced here, but also a bunch of other hormones. Let me just go ahead and label them now so they're here for you, okay? And then you'll fill them in. The pituitary gland is making growth hormone. I'm just going to abbreviate them. Growth hormone, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, adrenocortical hormone, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, and the melanin is referring to melanocyte stimulating hormone. And I'm missing one. It'll come to me in a moment, okay? There's one more. It'll come to me in a moment. But growth hormone, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, ACTH, and TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, plus MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. I'll come back and fill it in when I think about it. Then the thyroid gland. We know the thyroid gland is releasing thyroid hormone. That's not difficult. Thyroid hormone is very much involved with your overall metabolism. You may know people who have a hyper or hypothyroid condition, which definitely involves weight and some overall metabolism. Prolactin, thank you very much. Absolutely. PRL, it would be the initial. So add one more back, and PRL, prolactin. Thank you very much. So there's 6 on the bottom, and then there was that melanocyte stimulating hormone. Thyroid is also involved with calcium. What did we see? We'll talk more about calcium, but what else is coming from the thyroid that we already talked about with skeletal system? Yeah, calcitonin, right? So I'll try to be as complete as I can here. So calcitonin is released by the thyroid gland. We saw it. In fact, it was released by what was called the C cells of the thyroid gland. And we know it's released when calcium is too... Anybody remember? Parathyroid was when it was too low, and calcitonin was released when it was too high. Adrenal glands. The adrenal gland, do you agree that the pituitary gland is really 2 parts? There's the posterior and the anterior. The posterior pituitary is more nervous tissue. The anterior pituitary is more glandular. Same is true with the adrenal gland. There is a medulla and a cortex. And we'll be talking mostly about the cortex here. The cortex is going to be releasing a number of hormones involved with mineral balance. The one there that I want you to know is aldosterone. Remember, aldosterone was helping to regulate sodium. It's a mineral. And metabolic control and resistance to stress. So we'll see cortisol also made here. Again, these are all this is just introduction. I'm throwing out a few extra names just to help you pull it all together as we start. It's not an exhaustive list. Cortisol is under the stress. And then in the medulla, right, in the center, in the meaty middle, do you agree the cortex is the outside edge? So the outside edge of the adrenal gland makes certain hormones. The inside, the medulla, or the medulla is going to make other hormones, and this is where you get a lot of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So really the adrenal glands are 2 different glands kind of mushed together. The cortex and the medulla. Then there's the pancreas. The pancreas, when we hear the word pancreas, we normally think of insulin. And that's true. Insulin is made. But there's there's about 4 other hormones that we'll mention. The other one is glucagon. So let me write these down. We recognize insulin. The opposite hormone is glucagon. And there's a couple others. I'll stop there for now. Made from the pancreas. Those are mostly involved with uptake of energy and the digestive process. The pineal gland, I've already mentioned melatonin. Melatonin was one of the amino acid derived hormones. And melatonin is involved with your circadian rhythms, helping to control your 24-hour clock. Maybe also helping to regulate ovarian cycles and reproductive cycles. Parathyroid gland, we already know this one. The parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone. That's all it releases. And as we said, that is helping with calcium regulation when calcium is too low. So I think hopefully already you realize that I'm saying a lot of words, many of which you have already heard, but now you're going to be more responsible for knowing what these hormones do and how they work in our overall body. Now the other organs. Heart, you already know one. Regulating blood volume, ANH or ANP, same thing. Atrial natriuretic peptide or atrial natriuretic hormone, you'll see both names. ANP, ANH. Thymus. The thymus is a place where many of your white blood cells develop, and there's a number of hormones produced there. Thymosin is one. I'll just say it. I'll write it down here. Now, these won't be our major ones, but we will go through these. So thymosin. It ends in IN. What does it suggest to you about it?
Protein.
It's a protein. Okay. So if it ends in IN, it's not going to be a steroid protein. A steroid hormone. If it ends in IN, it's going to be a protein hormone. It may be a peptide or it may be a longer protein hormone, but it's certainly not going to be a steroid hormone. The digestive tract, along the gut and the stomach, there's quite a few hormones made. The kidneys, you already know that one, renin, for sure, is made by the kidneys to help regulate blood pressure. And you know that aldosterone aldosterone affects the kidneys also in how they deal with electrolytes. And then the gonads, right? And that would be the estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. So far, doing okay? Doing okay? So I really want to take this as slowly and as, step by step. I don't want to go too fast with this. Now, the image you see here is also on page 589 in your book and is basically just identifying the location of these glands. This should not be difficult for you. So just identifying where these different glands are found in the body. The one that is hard to label always, always, always is the pineal gland. This is a very, very tiny gland. If someone points, or if I point to the brain, and we're talking about the endocrine system, you know where the hypothalamus is. Mm-hmm. It's right above the pituitary. Okay, it's right above the pituitary gland, and basically the pituitary hangs down from the hypothalamus. Mm-hmm. Any other place that's pointing to in the brain must be the pineal gland. Right. Okay, so just keep that in mind. It's going to be a little bit more posterior. It's very, very tiny, and it's even here, it's just this little tiny thing back toward the back of the corpus callosum, back in the diencephalon. Okay. But it's certainly not huge. Now, the other thing that's kind of hard to see are the parathyroid glands, because they are actually on the dorsal side of the thyroid gland. They're both in the neck. The thyroid gland is like a big butterfly-shaped gland in the neck. The parathyroids are just little nodules, little collections of cells on the back side. So if you've got thyroid issues, you may also have calcium issues, right? And if you get thyroid cancer and they destroy your thyroid gland, right, out of the cancer, you're going to definitely have issues with metabolism, weight gain, weight control, but you're also going to have issues with bone strength because your calcium homeostasis is completely shot if you lose your thyroid and parathyroid glands. Well, yeah, you'll be on medication, but you're going to be on, any of these things are hugely important. And without an endocrine gland, if it's lost for some reason, you're going to be seeing an endocrinologist a lot and doing a lot of supplements and a lot of hormonal supplements trying to make the balance as best you can. So how does that make sense so far? Now, the next thing is we have to think back to the types of molecules. I told you there were peptides, very, very small, amino acid derived. Then there were peptide or small protein type, and then there were the steroid hormones. And I've already alluded to this, but let's see if this makes sense. How is it that hormones are going to be released? How is it they're going to travel through the blood? And how is it they're going to enter their target? That's where we're heading. So hormone binding. I've already said that in order for a hormone to do its job, the cell must have a receptor. It must somehow recognize that molecule and accept that molecule. Now, you must have the receptor. Without the receptor, right, it doesn't matter how much of that hormone there is. This is, just as an aside, you've all probably heard of type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is not, in the classical sense, a problem with insulin. In fact, there's plenty of insulin. There might be too much insulin. The problem is that the insulin receptor is defective, and the body no longer is responsive to the insulin. And so there we see an issue where it's not the hormone that's out of whack, it's actually the cells don't respond to it. The receptor is defective in some way. So we'll talk more about that as we get there. And cells don't just respond to one hormone. Cells have multiple receptors and can respond to many, many hormones, not in isolation, but together. So this kind of also reminds us that, like the nervous system, we studied everything in isolation, and we kind of imagine that one neuron just talks to one other neuron, and it's just a simple little private conversation. But in fact, right, one neuron is being bombarded by hundreds or thousands of signals simultaneously. Same thing is true here. A cell can have hundreds of receptors and can be receiving signals from dozens of hormones at the same time, and the cell then has to kind of do a summation type thing and figure out, okay, what am I supposed to be doing with all these signals? So where can receptors be? I think we normally think of a receptor being on the plasma membrane, and that's the classic place. If a receptor is on the plasma membrane, well, let me keep going. A receptor in the plasma membrane, remember that water-soluble molecules cannot cross into a cell membrane, right? Water-soluble molecules, in other words, ones that travel through the blood just fine on their own, protein-type hormones, cannot just get into a cell, right? They must be welcome. They must bind to a receptor. And we talked about this second messenger system a little bit with taste. Recall that sodium and hydrogen, Na plus and H plus, were able to permeate directly into taste receptors for saltiness and sour and set up an action potential. But then there was sugar and bitter. And those signals required a second messenger. In other words, they bound to something, and then there was another molecule downstream, what we call a second messenger, that turned it on. So that's what happens here. These protein hormones bind to a receptor on the outside. The molecule, the hormone, does not come into the cell. It simply binds to the receptor on the outside and triggers something on the inside of the cell to occur in response to that. So the hormone becomes the primary signal, right? That's the first molecule. But then the first messenger. But then the second messenger is whatever happens on the inside of the cell once that hormone binds to the receptor. Typically, these are G proteins. And that's just a classification, kind of memorize it. It doesn't mean a whole lot to you, okay? But you'll see a lot of G proteins. Now, examples of this, an example of these second messengers are cyclic AMP. Okay, cyclic AMP is a molecule that works on the inside of the cell. And typically, increased levels of cyclic AMP will activate enzymes or open other ion channels or accelerate metabolic activity, whereas low levels of cyclic AMP typically have an inhibitory response. So they're going to kind of shut down cellular responses. Another really common second messenger is calcium. Sometimes when a protein hormone binds the receptor, it activate cyclic AMP. Other times, it has a lot to do with calcium. And we'll see calcium be a very big player in muscle, but it'll also be a big player here. And in fact, you saw calcium in what it did in the action potential, right? You saw calcium coming in and causing exocytosis. It's a little bit different, but you've certainly seen calcium do some pretty magical things.
Calcium would not be a second messenger.
Calcium would be a secondary, in that situation, no. In the
Okay.
synaptic vesicle, it would not be, it's a different scenario, but I'm just saying you've seen calcium that it can have rather significant effects. But no, it would not be considered a secondary messenger there. You're correct. Don't let me confuse you there. So calcium can come in and have a lot of effects, and we'll see that one of the ways that calcium works is through calmodulin. Look at that word. That seems like a whole new word. Calcium modulating ion.
Protein.
Right? A protein. It's a protein that is somehow modulated by calcium levels. So we'll see that calcium comes in, triggers calmodulin, right? A protein that is modulated by calcium and has other effects inside the cell. So here's a cartoon of this, just to see what's going on here. I know this is small. This is also directly out of your book. Let me give you an idea. On the top, we've got a hormone. The hormone is shown as a purple little molecule. It is going to bind. It's traveling through the blood, and it's going to bind to this specific receptor. That receptor binds only that hormone. It's very much like an enzyme lock and key type mechanism. As a result of the hormone binding the protein receptor, a G protein is activated, right? This hocus pocus second messenger occurs. Now that second messenger could be cyclic AMP or it could be calcium as good examples. Let's take a look. What happens? So usually once that G protein is activated, it will increase the levels of cyclic AMP. And let's look what cyclic AMP can do. Cyclic AMP can open ion channels. And now you're thinking all of a sudden maybe sodium, potassium. Or they can activate enzymes, speeding up metabolic processes. It's also possible. And then I should say, as cyclic AMP, look, this is cyclic AMP right here. As cyclic AMP is degraded, right, it reduces enzyme activity. So typically more cyclic AMP increases enzymes, and as that cyclic AMP is broken down, it decreases enzymes. And that's a good thing that cyclic AMP is broken down, isn't it? Because if every time a hormone bound, more cyclic AMP was made, and that cyclic AMP was not broken down, then the cell would be in overdrive all the time. This is sort of like acetylcholine and acetylcholinesterase, right? Acetylcholine is there. As long as it's there, things are happening. But acetylcholinesterase comes along and gets rid of the acetylcholine. Same idea. This cyclic AMP, once it's formed, will be destroyed, so you stop the effect. And or the binding of that hormone to the receptor can open a calcium channel. And that calcium channel will then bind to calmodulin, and calmodulin will then activate other enzymes. So again, what you're seeing, right? Hormone binds to receptor. Magic happens inside the cell, either through cyclic AMP or through the opening of calcium channels and calmodulin, and something metabolic happens. That's sort of the definition of a hormone. When it binds to a cell that has a receptor, it affects its metabolism. Usually we think of things being turned on, but some hormones, when they bind, actually turn things off, right? So the insulin glucagon, yin-yang, or the parathyroid calcitonin, yin-yang. We know that all hormones don't just turn things on. Some are very important in regulating downward processes. So let's just watch this little video and just enjoy, okay? Let me get this going here.
Hormone-producing tissues located throughout the body. The circulating hormones control the rates of body processes and maintain homeostasis. Within an endocrine gland, endocrine cells secrete hormones, which diffuse into nearby capillaries. The cardiovascular system transports these hormones throughout the body, affecting target cells in various tissues. Target cells for a specific hormone have receptors that bind the unique three-dimensional shape of that hormone. Cells that lack a specific hormone receptor are unresponsive to that hormone, even if a high concentration of the hormone is present around the cells. Although cells express a variety of receptors, we'll focus on one particular class: receptors that bind water-soluble hormones and exert their effects through the intracellular second messenger, cyclic AMP. These receptors are embedded in the cell's plasma membrane because water-soluble hormones cannot enter the target cell directly. A hormone molecule, acting as the first messenger, binds to its receptor, causing the receptor to change shape. The receptor can now activate specific intracellular G proteins. The activation process begins with the release of a GDP molecule from the G protein in exchange for a GTP molecule. This causes the G protein to change shape and become active. The hormone-bound receptor activates many individual G proteins, which greatly amplifies the signal from a single hormone molecule. An activated G protein diffuses along the plasma membrane until it binds to and activates the enzyme.
I meant to stop it, not turn it off. I wanted to say one thing that she just mentioned, is that a single hormone molecule has an amplifying effect on the inside. So the binding of a hormone to the receptor doesn't turn on one cyclic AMP molecule, it can turn on many through that amplification idea. One of the hallmarks of hormones is that they are released in extremely low concentrations. Okay, so you're never going to have high levels of hormones. They're always very low levels, and just a little bit goes a long way through this idea of amplification. Okay, so it binds to the cell, and then the cell does this second messenger amplification, making the signal even greater than it would have been without that amplification.
Change shape. The receptor can now activate specific intracellular G proteins. The activation process begins with the release of a GDP molecule from the G protein.
It's like ATP.
In exchange for a GTP molecule.
Another energy molecule.
This causes the G protein to change shape and become active. The hormone-bound receptor activates many individual G proteins, which greatly amplifies the signal from a single hormone molecule. An activated G protein diffuses along the plasma membrane until it binds to and activates the enzyme adenylate cyclase. Once active, adenylate cyclase converts ATP to the second messenger, cyclic AMP.
So there's where we get the
These
AMP.
many molecules of cyclic AMP from each activated cyclase enzyme represent a further amplification of the initial hormone signal. The increased concentration of cyclic AMP activates enzymes known as protein kinases. These activated protein kinases phosphorylate a variety of proteins within the cell. This changes the activity of those proteins and generates the cell's hormone response.
Usually
The cell's
excitatory,
response is
but not always.
characterized by the specific proteins present in the cytoplasm, only some of which can be phosphorylated by protein kinase.
Then we have to
The
shut it off.
cellular response diminishes rapidly once the hormone is no longer bound to its receptor. G proteins hydrolyze their bound GTP to GDP, returning to their inactive state, and dissociate from adenylate cyclase. This ends cyclic AMP production. Existing cyclic AMP is degraded by the enzyme phosphodiesterase, which is already present in the cytoplasm.
Sort of like acetylcholinesterase.
As the cyclic AMP concentration returns to resting levels, protein kinase inactivates, preventing further protein phosphorylation. The target cell has now returned to its pre-stimulus condition, ready to respond to future hormone signals. The signal of a water-soluble hormone binding to a receptor on the plasma membrane is amplified through the activation of many G proteins and the generation of even more cyclic AMP. This cyclic AMP activates many protein kinases, which affect many thousands of intracellular proteins, all shaping the target cell's response. The response of many target cells produces the homeostatic and regulatory effects controlled by the endocrine system.
Okay, just a quick review, and just another way of hearing it. Now, likely, somewhere along through the homework, you'll probably watch that video again and answer a couple questions about it as you're doing some homework assignments from Chapter 16. Okay. Now, that is what you want to keep in mind for protein, right? For protein. But what about steroids? What did we say about steroids? Lipid molecules. Can they travel through the blood on their own? No, they have to be carried by some sort of carrier, but they are lipids. They're permeable. They can go right into the membrane, which means they don't need a plasma membrane receptor. These molecules are able to go right through the membrane. So that's what's the deal here. Is now we've got a molecule that can diffuse, go straight through the plasma membrane, and directly go not just in through the plasma membrane, but oftentimes go all the way to the nucleus. Goes through the nuclear membrane, and those steroid hormones sometimes directly bind to DNA. When a molecule binds directly to DNA, it is going to affect some of those genes' transcription. So what's that? Let's go back, flash back to transcription. Transcription is when DNA is made into mRNA, and then mRNA is made into protein through translation. So these hormones don't go through the G protein binding on the surface. Instead, they can go straight to the source. They can go right to the cytoplasm or all the way to the nucleus and directly affect gene transcription and protein synthesis. So example, testosterone can go in and directly influence muscle fibers and muscle size. So testosterone, we know that testosterone is necessary to maintain muscle mass. And one of the reasons that this whole new T-patch testosterone thing is going on is that science is suggesting to men that if your muscle mass is beginning to decline with age, that your body's T levels, your testosterone levels are dropping. And that's one of the things that's driving the testosterone patches. Because this molecule can go in and directly affect transcription of and production of muscle cells. So here's how this works. A little bit different. Now, number one, here's the steroid hormone. What this does not show is that this steroid hormone would not be floating freely through the blood, but instead would be carried by some molecule. And I've already told you that that molecule, because it's carrying it, would also protect the steroid hormone from being degraded. So it's going to have a longer half-life. It's going to hang around longer than most protein hormones. Once it kind of jumps off its carrier, right? Can you imagine this? There's like a little dump truck here that's going to dump the hormone here at the gate. It has the ability of going straight through the membrane. It doesn't have to ask permission. It doesn't have to bind to a receptor on the surface. And it can also go all the way into the nucleus and directly bind to DNA, and as a result, affect transcription. Again, we normally think of these things as increasing protein levels, increasing the transcription of some group of genes, but it's also possible that these hormones downregulate the production of some gene products. So again, we normally think of them being turning on, but remember that all these things have some yin-yang experiences or some yin-yang type things. Now, it is possible. I told you now that the hormone binds to a receptor in the nucleus. There could be a cytoplasmic receptor, right? But it's definitely inside the cell. It's either inside the cytoplasm, maybe mitochondria, maybe on a Golgi or something like that, or it's going to be all the way in.
So if it goes into the nucleus and it binds to the DNA,
Yep.
then it causes the transcription, but then does it release the DNA, or does it stick around?
Okay, so we haven't gotten into this, but DNA, what genes are turned on and what genes are turned off in your nucleus are controlled by proteins called transcription factors. They are proteins that bind to the DNA and tell the cell to make more of it or less of it. And these hormone proteins go in and influence those transcription factors. And much like before, there's a half-life. There's a time at which they'll start being degraded. As long as they're bound, they're going to increase the protein, and then they get degraded and that signal is decreased. So there's still regulation. You can guarantee there's always going to be regulation. These things are not going to come in and just get stuck and turned on forever. That'd be like cancer, right? And that does happen outside of the scope right now of this class. So we've got the idea that protein hormones touch a hormone receptor on the outside, second messenger signal on the inside to increase metabolic activity. Steroids go right through the membrane to either the cytoplasm or the nucleus, but either way, again, increase metabolic activity. Or I shouldn't say always increase, change, right? Change metabolic activity. So if I say increase, it's not always increase. It could be increase or decrease. So I really should be changing my verbiage to changing the metabolism. So let's take a look at thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone. What kind of class was this? Go back. Was it a peptide or an amino acid type? Thyroid hormone. Was it an example of an amino acid or an example of a amino acid, right? So it's very small, right? But it's not a steroid, right? We agree it's not a steroid hormone. And this is going to be an exception, though. This is going to be an exception. It's very small. You agree? It's made of a single amino acid. And guess what? It is able to be transported across the cell membrane, and it binds to the mitochondria. Let's think about this. If someone has hypo or hyperthyroidism, they usually have some sort of issue with weight or overall metabolism, right? There's a weight gain or a weight loss. And that is going to be largely connected to the mitochondria, the organelles that make ATP. So one of the things that thyroid hormone does is it goes into a cell and binds to the mitochondria and increases ATP production. And then the ATP goes on to do all the cellular metabolism. So a person with normal or high thyroid function usually has what we call, hypermetabolism. They lose weight. They can't gain weight. I can't imagine that ever being a problem, and I know it can be. I don't want to minimize that. People with hypothyroidism, right, typically gain weight. Again, what's going on? The thyroid hormones are not activating the ATP. The cells do not have the energy necessary to do the cellular processes, and as a result, weight is typically gaining. And so the thyroid hormone goes into it talks to the mitochondria. It also goes in and talks to genes directly in the nucleus, and therefore also affects metabolic activity. Sort of like pathways in the nervous system. A hormone doesn't necessarily have a single target, right? There could be multiple places in the brain where signals are sent. We know that vision doesn't just go to the visual cortex, it also goes to the limbic system, that idea. And same idea here, thyroid hormone is going to affect mitochondria as well as go into the nucleus and affect some other gene transcription. So let's just take a look at this picture to make sense of this. So here's thyroid hormone. It is able to get across the membrane. It's really small. So it gets across the membrane, comes in, and binds to, there's a mitochondrion. That increases ATP. It also goes straight into the nucleus, binds transcription factors in the DNA, which again increases protein synthesis of certain molecules, all of which regulate, here all it says is target cell response, right? Whatever that modulating effect is it increasing or decreasing? It just is alternating, right? Alternating cellular activity. this cell could also be receiving the opposite hormone, right? It could be receiving thyroid hormone saying make more ATP. It could be receiving an antagonistic hormone telling the cell also to make less ATP, and the cell has to sort of do a summation type thing to figure out what's going to lead the show here, which signal is stronger. Okay, so now I'm going to start going through the list of hormones. So we've got the idea that hormones come in different flavors, different types, and that chemical composition affects how they are received in the cell and where their targets are. Let's start with the hypothalamus. This is the highest level of endocrine function. It is, as we've already said, integrating both the nervous and the endocrine systems. And there are a couple of hormones here, right? We've already seen ADH. We know ADH is released, and oxytocin also. The nuclei below it, what does that mean again? What's a nucleus? A cluster of cell bodies. So in other words, in the hypothalamus, there's a couple of clusters of cell bodies. One of them is called the supraoptic nucleus. It's from that one that ADH is made. And there's another little nucleus called the paraventricular nucleus from which oxytocin is made. Where are those hormones going? They're being made, hold on, they're being made, I misspoke, they're being made by the hypothalamus, and where are they stored? Posterior pituitary, okay? Not the anterior. The anterior pituitary is where I lifted off the LH and the FSH and all those. This is the posterior pituitary. Now, in addition to oxytocin and ADH, the hypothalamus also makes another group of hormones called regulatory hormones. And all of these are going to have in their name inhibiting or regulating. So you'll see the terms inhibiting or regulating in the names of these hypothalamic hormones. These hormones are going to be released to the anterior pituitary. So let's recap. Oxytocin and ADH go directly to the posterior pituitary, and then they'll be released, right, and affect water balance and uterine contractions at their appropriate time. The regulatory hormones are going to be sent from the hypothalamus. They're going to go down to the anterior pituitary. And some of these will also go down to the adrenal medulla, okay? And that's going to be the sympathetic, parasympathetic system that we'll get to. So let's take a look at this. We're looking at the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has some nuclei, right? Some clusters of cell bodies. These cell bodies are the ones producing these hormones. ADH and oxytocin are made, and they, look at the green. Basically, this is kind of a cool story. These two hormones, ADH and oxytocin, are actually made by neuron-like molecules and are sent directly down to the posterior pituitary. It's really a nervous system connection. The posterior pituitary is derived of nervous tissue, whereas the anterior pituitary is more glandular, and what you see is that these regulatory hormones are made and they are released down to the anterior pituitary. In addition, the hypothalamus talks to, in red, talks to the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal medulla, remember, is where some catecholamines are made, where the epinephrine and norepinephrine are made. So we got a couple different ways, right, that the hypothalamus talks. That's why we say the hypothalamus is sort of the kingpin. It's the head of the endocrine system because it influences posterior, anterior pituitary, and goes down and influences the adrenal medulla.
You said the anterior is more glandular than posterior?
Yes. So the pituitary gland is really like two things stuck together. The posterior is nervous tissue. That's why it was called the neurohypophysis. Remember that term in the brain list? Neurohypophysis. That was the posterior pituitary. It's derived of nervous tissue. if I don't think I had it on the list, but the opposite of that is the adenohypophysis. That's the anterior pituitary, and adeno means gland. So it is more glandular, more epithelial in nature versus nervous tissue in nature like the posterior pituitary.
Thank you.
Now, this connection, right, there's a really cool connection, a very tight connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. When I say hormones, we normally think of hormones traveling through the entire circulation, right? But the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland is so tightly controlled that there's a direct connection. And that direct connection is called the hypophyseal portal system. In other words, what the hypothalamus releases does not have to travel through the entire blood system and then come back to the pituitary gland, right? It has a direct connection from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary. We know it's just a short distance anatomically, but these hormones do not have to circulate through the entire body in order to influence the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland hangs down from the hypothalamus on what's called the infundibulum. The infundibulum is like this stalk, like this little thing that hangs down, and that's called the infundibulum. And in there are fenestrated capillaries. Fenestrated capillaries were ones with little holes, windows in them. And that makes sense. We always talked about fenestrated capillaries being where there are hormones because these molecules need to enter and leave the bloodstream so easily. And portal. This is the word that I'll talk about again. Portal system is where there's two capillary beds in a row. Now, the only other place you've seen a portal system in your experience with me is in the kidneys. Remember, there was the glomerulus capillary bed, and then after that, you came to a second capillary bed, either the peritubular or the vasa recta. Same idea. Don't go back and worry about the kidney. We'll come back and revisit that organ later in the course, but you may recall there were two capillary beds in a row. We've seen at least that deal go on before, and that's what happens here. There is the release of the hormone by the hypothalamus at a capillary bed, and then the pickup of those hormones just a short distance away in the second capillary bed in the anterior pituitary. So it's just a way for these two anatomical structures to talk to each other. And like it says in the last bullet, that allows the hypothalamic hormones to reach the anterior pituitary without going through and being diluted by the general circulation. Direct connect. And so that's shown here in this picture. Again, we've got these nuclei, supraoptic. What did that make?
Chiasm.
The supraoptic nucleus made which hormone? Oxytocin or ADH? ADH. So again, what it's showing you is that there's a certain group of cells in the hypothalamus that make ADH, and there's a certain group of cells in the hypothalamus that make oxytocin. And look what happens. They go directly down and talk to the posterior pituitary. That's where they're stored. Versus there are the other hormones that are being released, and they're going to go directly down into the anterior pituitary. Again, you see a double capillary bed. You notice, if you look at this, and it's hard to, I know these slides are really small, take a look in your book. This is figure 16.4, but it will lay out the fact that you've got two capillary beds in a row. Now, the portal system, right, this release of hormones going down to the anterior pituitary, there's two groups of hormones. They're collectively called the regulatory hormones, and as I said, they all have in their name either releasing or inhibiting. I may have said regulating earlier. Okay, so backwards on that. I think I said regulating. I meant releasing. They'll all have releasing in their name, or they'll all have inhibiting in their name. That will tell you. When you see a hormone's name and it has a releasing or inhibiting in its name, you know it's coming from the hypothalamus. So let's talk about these hormones. We're down now in the pituitary gland. Collectively, the pituitary gland is called the hypophysis. As I've said before, there it is. There's the adenohypophysis, the anterior, and the neurohypophysis, the posterior pituitary. You know that the pituitary gland is protected in part by the sella turcica and the sphenoid. That's old news. You know that. There are 9 hormones made here. 2 by the neurohypophysis. In fact, they're not even made there, but they're released from there, aren't they? Again, that's the oxytocin and the ADH. And then the other 7 are coming from the adenohypophysis, from the adrenal gland. And these are all called tropic hormones. Tropic means influencing or turning. They're going to turn things on or influence things. All of these work through a second messenger system. So what does that tell you about their chemical properties? If they work through a cyclic AMP second messenger system, they're not steroids. It means that they are all binding to a receptor on the surface of a cell and interacting at the surface and then setting up that cascade inside the cell. Again, this is just giving you a visual, reminding you that the pituitary gland is a double, really 2 organs that grew side by side together. The back side, the neurohypophysis, the front side, the adenohypophysis, both protected by the sella turcica and held onto the hypothalamus by that stalk. And this stalk region where it hangs down is called the infundibulum. Okay, infundibulum. Okay, so let's start the hormone, we'll call it the hormone parade here. Okay? Anterior pituitary. First one, TSH. I've told you all of these were cyclic AMP protein type hormones, so we've got that. This hormone, as the name suggests, is going to what? Stimulate the thyroid gland. So the TSH is going to be released by the anterior pituitary, and it's going to go into the general circulation, but it's primarily going to be targeting the thyroid, and the thyroid cells will then have a receptor for this hormone. Released in response to thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, from the hypothalamus. I'll show you a picture of this in a moment. What this is saying is this. I'll put it over on the side. Here's your hypothalamus. It is releasing TRH. Okay? That hormone is going down through the hypophyseal portal system and is going down to the anterior pituitary just below. The TRH releases TSH. And then the TSH travels through the bloodstream and goes down to the thyroid. Okay, so we're going to see the same overall scheme. Hypothalamus releases a hormone, sends out a releasing hormone. That releasing hormone then gives instructions to the anterior pituitary to release its associated hormone, in this case, TSH. And that TSH, as the name suggests, is going to go on to stimulate the thyroid gland. Then, once the thyroid gland is stimulated, it releases thyroxine. Okay? So, overall idea. We're going to be seeing this idea. Again, anything made by the hypothalamus is going to have R in it, right? Releasing, or an I in it, inhibiting. The body would never make any of these things more than it needs, and that's where we're going to see this idea of negative feedback. So if any of these molecules, TRH, TSH, or thyroxine, are being overproduced, they're going to send signals back to home base saying, we've had enough. And that's going to make sure that these molecules are never overproduced and that their levels are constantly balanced. Second hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Break that word down. That's a mouthful. It's a hormone, tropic, influencing the adrenal cortex, right? So adrenocorticotropic, adrenal cortex. It's a hormone. It's released by the anterior pituitary. It's also known as corticotropin, if you happen to see that floating around in the literature. it is going to go down to the adrenal cortex. It is going to be turned on by corticotropin releasing hormone. So if we were to draw this sequence, what would we see? Again, we see the hypothalamus making CRH, CRH turning on the hypothalamus to release ACTH, ACTH traveling through the blood down to the, I'm going to draw that as the adrenal gland, and we're going to the adrenal cortex, right, the outer layer of the adrenal gland. The adrenal cortex would then be making other hormones like aldosterone. That's the only hormone I've said to you really that you know already that's made by the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex, when I passed by, I told you had a lot to do with mineral, hormones of mineral regulation. Okay, so again, we see this sequence, right? And this is called an axis. You'll see this word axis. This is an axis. This is a group of hormones that work kind of in a linear fashion down this axis, from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, down to the target organ, and then affecting something else. Okay? So again, this is where there's lots of terms, but I'm trying to make it as gentle and kind as I can. Don't shoot the messenger. Then there's also gonadotropins. Now that is a generic word. There's no hormone called just gonadotropin. Gonadotropin would be hormones that do what? Influence or control the gonads. This is going to include FSH and LH. Only FSH is on this slide at this point. And the anterior pituitary is going to be given permission to release this hormone by GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. So let's do the same idea. So the hypothalamus is going to release GnRH. That's going to give permission for the anterior pituitary to release, in this case, FSH. We'll also see LH. Those are both gonadotropins influencing the gonads. Those hormones are going to go, for example, to the ovaries, and the ovaries would then release, for example, estrogen, okay, or progesterone. Those hormones could also go to the testes and cause the production of testosterone. So there could be another, right? We could have another. I've run out of room, but this could also have gone to the testes and caused the production of testosterone. We're starting to see the pattern, right? Over and over, kind of the same thing over and over, different players, enough repetition in the naming that I think it becomes very, very doable. The other gonadotropin besides FSH is LH, luteinizing hormone, and that in females is related to ovulation and also to promoting the secretion of estrogen and progesterone, like I just told you a moment ago. In the males, it is also important for protecting the interstitial cells. You may know those cells as, another name, the interstitial cells are also the Leydig cells, and the Leydig cells are the cells that make testosterone. Okay, so again, like I just drew before, luteinizing and FSH can go down to the testes and increase levels of testosterone. Stacy.
So the FSH and the LH, the example we just did, those are made by the hypothalamus but stored in the anterior pituitary.
Nope. They are made by the anterior pituitary.
They're
They're told to be released by the gonadotropin releasing hormone. So just like before.
Which is made with it.
Right. The hypothalamus makes the gonadotropin releasing hormone, gives permission for the anterior pituitary to make and release the gonadotropins, which are LH and FSH. Those molecules travel through the general blood circulation and travel to the receptors, primarily the gonads, where they influence sex hormone production, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone.
So when there's too much, that's when the negative feedback comes.
If there was too much, then
the
it would feed back.
hypothalamus to stop.
Yes. And sometimes it'll feed all the way back to GnRH, and sometimes it will also feed back to the anterior pituitary. Sometimes it'll feed back in both places, just shut the thing down. This is another reason why you don't want to be messing around with hormones. why endocrinology is a touchy area. If you don't truly have a hormone deficiency, but the doctor gives you hormones, and this is common in, for example, thyroid patients. A family has weight issues, right? And every time they go to the doctor, they check their thyroid, but the thyroid keeps testing normal. Maybe low normal, but normal. The doctor usually still will not give that patient thyroxine or thyroid hormones, because to give the patient too many thyroid hormones then sends signals back to the brain saying, shut down all of the hormones. Okay? So it creates other cascading problems. And hormones do not act in total isolation. You're talking about a hormone in your total blood system that can influence many other tissues. So you have to be really, really careful with hormones. There's a lot of testing, and it's kind of outside the scope of this course, but I'll allude to it a little bit, that a little bit goes a long way. I told you that hormones are always in very, very low concentrations. So just a little bit can go a very, very long way. And these hormones have, some of them, a rather significant half-time in the blood. That means a half-life. They hang around. So you can't just give somebody a hormone and the next day expect it to be gone. It hangs around and has influencing effects for quite a while. Again, another reason why you have to be careful. These molecules hang around in the blood, and they have global effects and can really be nasty. Another one, growth hormone, also made by the anterior pituitary. Well, here we have an inhibiting and a releasing hormone that kind of tell it to go up or down. So the hypothalamus is going to release either GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, or GHIH, growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Okay? And that is going to tell the anterior pituitary to release or not release growth hormone. When growth hormone is released, it goes in part, goes to many places, but it also goes to the liver, and it can synthesize other molecules that have an effect on somatomedins. Look at that word, somato. What is soma? Body. Somato. So it's a molecule that really has an effect on the overall body's growth. So you would expect a lot of growth hormone, right, to be produced during early years when the bones are elongating and the muscles are developing. But then you wouldn't want too much released once you got to your adult height. Now, I mentioned to you, right, in the bone chapter about giantism. And that was where the pituitary gland was overproducing growth hormone. So here's that situation. So for some reason, the pituitary gland is not being regulated. Usually there's a tumor involved. That tumor is over-releasing and not being inhibited. It's overproducing growth hormone. What if that growth hormone is overproduced before puberty? Then a person could have giantism because the bones keep on growing longer. But what if that tumor or that imbalance occurs after epiphyseal plates have closed and no more elongation has occurred? Then you'll see symptoms of Shrek, right? The acromegaly, the idea that the hands, the face, the jaw get very large, but the long bones in the body have stopped growing. You can't suddenly make bones grow longer once the plates have closed. So the timing of growth hormone over expression can affect, are you going to be a giantism, or are you going to have some sort of acromegaly, Shrek, Andre the Giant situation?
So then, once you're done with puberty, unless there's some weird tumor going on, you no longer make...
Not as much growth hormone. You're going to have enough to maintain muscle and bone growth and things, but you're not going to be overproducing it. So once you hit puberty, exactly right, there's going to be a coming down, a regulation of this molecule. If you never had enough of it, maybe your hypothalamus was over-releasing inhibiting hormone. Or maybe your anterior pituitary never made enough growth hormone. Or maybe your cells didn't respond to growth hormone because they had a problem with the receptor. Any of those situations could lead to dwarfism. Right? Think about the three situations. Either the hypothalamus is overproducing inhibiting hormone, right? It tells the body not to make growth hormone. Or the anterior pituitary gland is not producing growth hormone. Or, for some reason, cells that should be responding to growth hormone, their receptor is defective. And so the cells don't respond to it even though it's being made. In all three of those situations, the body would sense not enough growth hormone. And the person could be left as a dwarf, right? The true little dwarfism where everybody, you're just a little tiny doll, right? Perfectly proportioned. That's different from the other condition that I mentioned, achondroplasia, which is a genetic dwarfism where the trunk is of normal length, but the arms and legs are shorter. Okay, so two different kinds of dwarfism. There's more than that, but those are the two big ones. So we're making connections here, aren't we, with what we've already talked about with skeletal system, hormones, and we'll also be making some connections with the nervous system as we go through this. So what does growth hormone do? This kind of continues to what Stacy was asking. So it definitely has an effect on epithelial and connective tissues. It's going to keep tissues going. It has an effect on adipose. Growth hormone actually stimulates the breakdown of fats. If you're breaking down fats, that means the energy is available, isn't it, for synthesis, for anabolic processes. And it goes to the liver and also releases glucose into the bloodstream. What's it doing? It's going to tissues, telling them to give the body the tools necessary, right, to grow. It's giving your body more glucose. It's giving your body the release of energy from fatty acids and stimulating growth. If you didn't have that, right, you wouldn't grow. Prolactin, PRL. This is working with other hormones. When we think of PRL, you normally would think of mammary gland development. It certainly is very important in milk production during pregnancy and during lactation thereafter. But there's also some prolactin important factors involved even in sperm production. So it's not just a female hormone. None of these are just sex specific. They have different targets, maybe even different levels, but still all these hormones are present in both sexes. This is inhibited by PIH. Again, you see an I in it, so you know that the PIH is coming from the hypothalamus, right? The hypothalamus. Number 7. So there's 6. Those are 6 hormones that we've talked about. They are usually considered tropic, right? They influence things. The 7th and kind of stepsister, right, hormone is MSH. It's melanocyte stimulating hormone, and it's really more about development. It is helping your melanocytes during skin development make and increase melanin production. As an adult, it's really not doing anything. So MSH, whereas all the other hormones are constantly being still released and regulated throughout your body, MSH is more of a developmental hormone. It is really not something you're worried about as an adult. So that's why I'm saying it's really kind of a different hormone. There would not be any MSH in your circulation. I think there is something to do with that. Yes. So, I think there is a darkening of, and I think there might be something about MSH involved with that. Okay. No, but yeah, there is something there. Now that you say that, yeah. Question. Another question.
Why are PRL and pH inhibited for the rest of the
Yeah. So, in other words, it sounds like the ones that have inhibiting hormones would be released kind of at a steady state all the time, and the body has to come along and say, put the brakes on it. Other times, it sounds like the body needs to be told to step on the gas. So don't go too crazy on it, but just kind of imagine some of these are being produced all the time, and the brain has to come in and say, stop it, inhibit it. Other ones aren't being released until you put on a gas pedal and put out a releasing hormone. So here's just a picture. Here are our 7. And honestly, you should be able to click off those 7 hormones. Okay, 6 plus 1. So you'll see melanocyte stimulating hormone sitting over here kind of on its own. But here are those 6. We went through those. We talked about them a little bit. TSH, ACTH, FSH and LH, GH and PRL. And then this also tells you the picture, what is the target gland. It doesn't yet say what the target it doesn't yet say what hormones are released in response to that. It doesn't say what it does, but it does tell you where the primary target is. So if you wanted to take that image and just below it, right, put in what? What could you do here? In fact, you could expand this image and put, here's the hypothalamus.
We could put in the
And that would be what? TRH, right? You see what I'm doing? So you could kind of expand that if it helped you pull all this together. And for growth hormone, there was what? GH, IH, and GH, RH. You with me? And then you could draw a line underneath that and say, okay, at least what he said so far, the testes will make testosterone, ovaries will make estrogen and progesterone. The growth hormone went to the liver, for example. The prolactin goes to the mammary gland, that's already shown there. The adrenal glands, we're going to make, for example, aldosterone. Okay. So use that, just kind of use that. Now, if you are flipping through the yellow page that I gave you, you can also appreciate how you can use that. So if you look on page 4, 5 of that handout, page 4, boom, there they are. There are the hormones made by the anterior pituitary, and then it says what's the function, okay? And then I've got the two that are made by the posterior pituitary. You know, what's made and what's their function. So it's going to help you write it down in another place in an organized way. Now, we're kind of backing up. We're going back to the pituitary, this time to the posterior pituitary, and we know there are two main hormones here, ADH, also called vasopressin. Right? What do we know about ADH? When you inhibit urination, what happens to your blood pressure? When you don't pee, your blood pressure goes up. So vasopressin, right, a protein that causes pressure on the vasos, on the vessels. So that's where this term is derived. So they're the same thing. Old-time docs will talk more about vasopressin. That's more of an older term. ADH is more of a newer term. You know what it's all about. You know that it's released. It's there are osmoreceptors in the hypothalamic area that are sensing osmolarity, right? How concentrated the fluids are, and as a response, are going to affect urination. This hormone is also inhibited by alcohol. So alcohol inhibits ADH. So that means that alcohol causes you to urinate, right? And caffeine is going to cause this, but that's an aside. Definitely ADH inhibited by alcohol. Oxytocin, the other one, right? This is going to be released, affecting the uterine wall. It also affects the myoepithelial cells of the breast. We haven't talked about these cells, but these are cells that are sort of half muscle, half epithelial. They're the milk-producing cells of the breast, but they also are, quote, squeezed, right, to release that product, myoepithelial cells. And those who have had children or those who have watched a new mother nursing for the first couple of days know how painful the first few feedings are, because oxytocin is causing uterine contractions, and suckling on the breast also releases that oxytocin and causes cramping of the uterus. And so the first few feedings can be very, very uncomfortable. Forget the breast and forget teeth and forget, biting and forget chafing. We're talking uterine contractions because that oxytocin is being released. How long does that last? Anybody, any personal recollection or know how long that?
Few days.
A few days. It gets worse or better?
They're stronger the more kids you have.
Okay, so it gets worse.
It has to work harder to shrink your uterus back.
Good point. Okay, so with further pregnancies, it takes more oxytocin to get everything back, so it lasts longer. This uncomfortable. But I know that part's worse. from Papa's perspective, watching my wife, that was worse. The contractions are worse than the breastfeeding part. Some people are agreeing? Okay. Can't tell you personally. Okay. Now, there's also some issue with oxytocin in sexual activity, so that would bring it back to also being involved with males. Okay, so again, males and females, don't think of these as being sex-specific hormones. They have other purposes. So there it is, just a picture, right? We've got two hormones made by the made by the hypothalamus, but released and stored from the posterior pituitary. Here they've got oxytocin abbreviated as OXT. I tend to, and I may have in the handout, just called it OT. Okay. And during labor, if they want to speed labor along, they give a woman Pitocin, which is a derivative, right, a man-made derivative, if you will, of this hormone. So it's going to speed things along, right? Speed along those uterine contractions. Ideally, right?
Worse.
I can only smile.
Yeah.
Right, Robert? We can just smile.
There you go.
Right? Eli? We can just smile. Okay.
It's like, whatever, Dad.
He looks like half of you. Okay.
Look at him. Is he sleeping?
Yeah.
Yes, he moved from the floor to the chair. Now he looks very comfortable. Okay, so
Ice cream.
we will definitely be treated tonight, right? So he's been very good. So negative feedback. I told you the body is never going to make something it doesn't need. This is true in any kind of enzyme situation. If A plus B makes C, and you've got buckets of C, right, something is going to shut down that chemical reaction. And that is the same thing true here in hormones. So if you've got plenty of something, it usually feeds back and says enough is enough. As we've seen, look at this bullet. The hypothalamus releases hormones that trigger the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. The AP then triggers release of secondary hormones from the target gland. If any of those are too much, right, then you'll come back and suppress the secretion from the hypothalamus, or go back and suppress the secretion from the AP, from the anterior pituitary. So let's take a look here at this table. This will help put it all together. On the left-hand side, RH is just releasing hormone, just a generic any of the releasing hormones. So the hypothalamus releases releasing hormone. That goes directly to the anterior pituitary and releases whatever hormone number 1 is. Then it goes to its target, which then releases hormone number 2, which then goes on to affect the target cells. If there's too much of hormone number 2, this blue line, negative feedback, it'll go back and it will have a negative effect here and or a negative effect back at the hypothalamus. And that's just kind of a general, always true schematic of how this will work. Just keep telling yourself the body's not going to waste its time and energy making things it doesn't need. And remember that a little bit goes a long way. So we never want too many of these hormones produced.
Would it go back and have an effect on both of them, or just one?
Usually both. It'll usually go back and do both, but sometimes one or the other. So this is just a general schematic. There could be some specific exceptions to one or the other, but right now just imagine both. Okay? So as an example, let's plug these in. Let's just think about this one. TRH, released by the hypothalamus, goes down to the pituitary and says turn on TSH. TSH then goes down to the thyroid and says turn on thyroid hormone, right? And if there was too much of this thyroid hormone, there would be feedback to the pituitary and to the hypothalamus. I know you don't have color on your handouts. You may want to make a note of it, though. Everything going down here is red. That's all stimulating, going down. And then the negative feedback going up is blue. Okay? So you see that going up here, these are negative. They're in the blue line. So everything going straight down is red, stimulating. Everything going back up is blue, inhibiting.
With like the negative feedback.
Yes.
So if there is too much hormone, when it goes back up, like in the thyroid case, have too much TSH, it's going to cause heart palpitation.
Right.
So is that because the negative feedback?
Okay. So,
To the heart?
yes. So, look what, yes. What if you are making too much hormone number 2? From a clinical standpoint, what does the doctor need to tease out? You walk in and you're just out of control. You've got too much thyroid hormone, right? What are the two possibilities?
Thyroid's not responding to
Either, right? Either your releasing hormone is too much, or is there too much of the anterior pituitary? Again, you've got to go back and tease out which is causing the overproduction and then treat it based upon that. And we'll talk about at the end primary versus secondary disorders. Okay, but you're definitely moving ahead. You're thinking ahead, and that's exactly what happens as these things get feedback regulated. There's deficits that could be short-term occurring. So let's think about this, and this is a specific example. Growth hormone. Right, I told you it goes to the liver. And the liver makes molecules called somatomedins. And those somatomedins are going to overall influence the growth of the entire soma of the body. Well, somatomedins are going to inhibit the release of GHRIH. Now, we're inhibiting an inhibitor. No, we're not. We're inhibiting a releasing hormone, right? We're going to inhibit GHRH, sorry. Let me get it right. GHRH. And we're going to stimulate GHIH. It's a mouthful. Okay. Or prolactin. If you had plenty of prolactin, prolactin is now going to inhibit, if you had plenty of prolactin, it's going to inhibit the release of PRF and increase the PIF, right? The PIH, okay? PIH. Too many abbreviations. Does that make sense, though? These both have the inhibiting and releasing hormone, don't they? And you were asking about that earlier. Why do we need both? These are the two where you had both examples. So if there was plenty of prolactin, it'll go back and do what? Let's just don't look at the abbreviations. They're too hard to say. If you got too much prolactin, you don't want any more made. So what are you going to do? You're going to inhibit the release, and you're going to do that by increasing the inhibiting hormone and decreasing the releasing hormone. It makes sense. You just got to read it and say it right. Okay. PRL, the
inhibiting and releasing
hypothalamus. You're right. Though, remember, anything releasing or inhibiting is coming from the hypothalamus. It's always your clue. So here it is, right? Pictures. Pictures are good. So this is talking about specifically the growth hormone. Again, we've got cells that come down. Now look at this, somatomedin. That is the effect of growth hormone. Growth hormone speaks to the liver. Liver makes somatomedins. If you've got plenty of somatomedins, what's it going to do? Go back and say, turn on the inhibiting and turn off, inhibit the releasing. So you see two different kinds of feedback, right? One is turning on, one is turning off. Both, though, relating to controlling or minimizing the overexpression of the growth hormone. And then here's a picture of the PRL as well. Same idea, right? That molecule, if it's too much prolactin, will actually go back and stimulate the inhibitor and inhibit the releaser. It's kind of like, flipping switches.
Wasn't prolactin a positive feedback?
Prolactin can be considered a positive feedback loop. It wasn't prolactin that was positive feedback, it was breastfeeding in general. So milk letdown is an example of positive feedback. That's what you're thinking about.
Yeah.
So when milk lets down, there's not something that shuts it off. if you will. So once released, it's going to go into a completion. That's why you're wearing some pads, right, or some what do you call them, right? What's the word for them? Pads, okay. Breast pads, okay. So that's why, right? Once it releases, it's gone. If the baby cries and milk releases and then it doesn't feed, pads. So you can't stop it. That's the idea of the positive feedback on the, but it's not because of prolactin, okay? Not because of prolactin. So this is the big picture. This is the big thing. I'm not going to ask you to draw this out. I could have. It would be horrible for me to grade. But basically, you will know this as you go through this. It's the same thing over and over. This is that figure with everything. Here are the hypothalamus releasing to the pituitary, and the hormones are released, and the target they're going to. What page is this? This is the critical image. And this is page, got my textbook buddy here, 597. So definitely stare at that page. This is way too small, obviously, to read off your PowerPoints. Okay, so we're done with the hypothalamus, and we're done with the pituitary, both posterior and anterior. Let me get through the thyroid gland, and I think that'll be plenty. But we'll see. We got about 10 minutes. Let me get through the thyroid gland. And first of all, where is the thyroid gland? In the anterior throat area, right? And it's like a butterfly. And it wraps around. And this area, where the two areas are connecting, is called the isthmus, right? The isthmus. And that's a geographical term as well. So the isthmus. And a lot of blood flow. You're going to find that most endocrine organs are quite red in color because there is a lot of blood flow. That makes sense. A lot of blood flow necessary to pick up those hormones, both to pick them up and to deliver them to these endocrine organs. Highly vascular, right? Definitely highly vascular. So when you look at these glands, again, very red, bright red, almost about as red as muscle, really bright. So this is just looking for the location. It is below the thyroid cartilage. Remember these? The big one is the thyroid cartilage. The second largest piece is the cricoid cartilage right here. And basically the isthmus is right below that, right over like the first and second C-rings of the trachea. So for a guy with a Adam's apple, that's part of the thyroid cartilage, and go a little bit lower. And if the thyroid gland is enlarged, you can certainly see it. A goiter type situation where it gets enlarged. Histology. We won't be looking under the microscope at this, but I want you to appreciate that there are a large number of follicles. Follicles are like these sphere-like areas. They're lined by simple cuboidal epithelium, and they hold basically what's called colloid. It's basically the protein. It's dissolved proteins, like a fluid-filled, concentrated gel pack. Okay, is what I think about these colloids. And here is where they release their proteins. Into that colloid, the follicle cells will secrete a globular protein, thyroglobulin. Now, here's the deal. This molecule is carried. Even though thyroid molecule is kind of small, it must be carried. It doesn't travel through the bloodstream without being carried. So we're going to talk about bound and unbound thyroid hormones. And if you clinical talk, they'll talk about your bound TH and your bound T3 and what's unbound and what's free and bound. Because this hormone is, even though it's small, it's hydrophobic and therefore must be carried. And what does that tell us about its interaction with the cell? Is it going to require a receptor? If it's hydrophobic?
Yeah.
What did I show you a few minutes ago when I talked about the thyroid hormone goes right into the mitochondria and right into the nucleus to increase energy? So there was no receptor. So it's a lipid-based. Even though it's a small, listen to what I'm trying to say, it's an amino acid-derived hormone. It's very small. But this particular amino acid is hydrophobic in nature, meaning that it doesn't interact with plasma well. it must be carried by this protein called thyroglobulin, and it can enter directly into the cell membrane, right? Just like a hormone, like any kind of steroid hormone. It is made by, or I should say, in the thyroid, there are C cells. And these C cells are found, and I don't care about their location. Just remember that C cells make calcitonin. Now, they always say that C stands for clear, and that's true, but it's really handy that it also starts with C starts with calcitonin.
Yeah.
So the C cells are clear in color, but they also produce the calcitonin. And again, what do we know about them? Calcitonin is released when calcium is high. So if you were to look under the microscope and look at thyroid gland, you'd see these big, this is that big old colloid. And it's surrounded by a single layer of simple cuboidal cells. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. Then, let me get in the color. Out here in this area is where you have some of these C cells. And those are the cells that make the calcitonin. I'm not going to have you label that, but it's a cool structure to look at under the microscope, but we won't be spending any time there. Now, you may have heard it said that iodine is necessary for thyroid function. In fact, that's one of the reasons why, historically, people would have iodine deficiencies. And in the development of our country, Mr. Morton, right, who makes salt, right, got along with the government and said, well, let's start iodinizing salt. So most of our salt now is iodinized. And that has certainly reduced, especially with the salt intake we have as a culture, has certainly reduced the iodine issues. So you have to have sufficient iodine for your thyroid to work properly. I'm not going to get crazy into this, but T4 is a thyroid hormone called thyroxine that has 4 iodines attached to it. That's where it gets its name, T4. There's 4 iodines. T3, triiodothyroxine, has only 3. So don't make it crazier than it is. Just T4 and T3, different forms. And it turns out, and these are made. These molecules are made there in the thyroid gland. Of these two, T4 is 90%. T4 is by far the most abundant made. T3 is much less. And I'm not going to get into all the enzymes that are involved here. I want you to just know about T3 and T4. T4, right, the bigger number, more abundant molecule. Mm-hmm. Most of this, though, is attached to a transport protein, because I told you that these T3 and T4 are unable to blend in, right, or to dissolve, dissociate, or carry in the blood. So they must be carried by these thyroid-binding globulins. You're picturing just a little protein that grabs these little molecules and carries them around. But think about this for a second. If the thyroxine is bound to the carrier, it is not able to jump into a cell, is it? So as long as it's bound up, its activity is null. So that's why when you're talking about thyroid hormones in the clinic, we're talking about free thyroid versus bound thyroid. If it's bound, it can't affect a cell. It's stuck to the carrier and can't hop off and influence a cell. Only the free stuff is hormonally active. And that's really what I want you to know there. Okay. So let's just take a look at this, and we'll finish up here. So here we are, starting out. We've got iodine, right, necessary. T3 and T4 are being made in the follicle cell and are diffusing out into the capillary. TSH, right, is definitely going to influence this, right? It's thyroid stimulating hormone. So we're definitely going to see that TSH is going to be stimulating the production of T3 and T4. And these T3 and T4 molecules are going to be bound to thyroglobulin. That's the carrier that's going to carry it around, okay, the thyroglobulin. So I am going to pick up with this, just kind of pick up with this and repeat this whole little story just for a couple minutes because I'm running out of gas and so are you, and it'll make more sense. What do we have left? If you look ahead, okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more thyroid. We'll repeat that story. We're going to go on to talk about the adrenal gland, and then we're going to spend some time definitely talking about the pancreas, insulin and glucagon and somatostatin, and then we'll go into a little bit more on diabetes because of insulin. We'll go into parathyroid and calcitonin again briefly. Growth hormone. You see where we're going, right? We're going to be going through now the other organs. So my advice to you is, today was, I think, palatable, but there's still a lot of details. Start using this yellow form to make sense of all this. Focus on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Start looking at the mastering questions. Do not wait till next Tuesday after lecture to start doing homework. Start bouncing those things off. And if you really have a few extra minutes between the sunshine this weekend, try to listen ahead to last winter's second presentation on endocrine, so that when you come in, you could already have this chart largely filled out, and when you come in next Tuesday, you're hearing it a second time, and then you're more prepared for what I'll be able to review with you. By next Tuesday, I'll have the exam written, and I will be able to entertain specific questions for you. So I know it's a lot to come in. We're still learning new material and have questions at the same time. We'll do the very best we can. Those who are in hybrid section, I definitely encourage you to come to Tuesday so that you can be part of this. If not, I'll record it, and you can still listen to the conversation on YouTube. Guys, have a great weekend, and I'll see you all very soon.